In the heart of a brutal mountain blizzard, with death only a few breaths away, Elias could no longer call for help. His leg was trapped beneath a fallen log, his warmth draining fast. Just as the white silence closed around him, a golden shape emerged through the storm. Not a rescuer, not another human, but the mother mountain lion he had pulled from the blizzard only hours before. She came back, not to attack, but to save him with the last strength she had left. And that moment changed everything that followed. The storm came down the spine of the Rockies like a living thing, a wall of white fury that erased the world one ridge at a time. By nightfall, the research cabin perched above the timberline was the last warm light for miles, its chimney struggling against winds sharp enough to cut breath in half. Inside, Elias Warren tightened another log into the stove and listened to the blizzard batter the wooden walls. After 20 years studying mountain lion behavior, after losing his wife on a climb, she should have survived. Silence had become the only companion he allowed himself. Even the distant reports of insurance claims after winter accidents felt closer to him than real human voices. He lowered himself into the creaking chair by the table and unfolded a notebook filled with sketches of paw prints. The storm should have kept even the hardiest predators in their dens. Nothing moved in weather like this. Nothing survived long in it. And yet, beneath the howl of the wind, something tapped, light, uneven, almost apologetic, against the wooden door. Elias froze. At this altitude, any visitor in a blizzard was more likely a hallucination than a living being. But the tapping came again, followed by a dragging sound that raised the hair on his arms. He stood and approached the door cautiously, one hand on the latch, the other wrapped around an old lantern. When he cracked the door open, a blast of icy air slammed into him, lifting the breath straight from his lungs. But that wasn't what stunned him. It was the creature collapsed on his threshold. A mother mountain lion coated in a crust of snow so thick she looked carved from ice. Her sides rose and fell in ragged shudders. One paw dragged limply, the pads cracked and bleeding. And tucked beneath her ribs was a cub no bigger than a house cat, shaking uncontrollably, its mew swallowed instantly by the wind. For a moment, Elias could only stare. A mountain lion should never approach a human dwelling. It went against every instinct in the species. But her eyes, God, her eyes, lifted to his with a desperation he had only ever seen in injured hikers begging to be pulled from the brink. This was no territorial threat. This was surrender, a silent plea. "Easy," Elias murmured, though no sound stood a chance against the gale. He crouched slowly, his joints protesting from years of cold fieldwork. The lioness didn't flinch as he reached toward her. Instead, she curled her body tighter around her cub, shielding it from him, from the storm, from everything. Elias knew that posture, a mother prepared to die before she let the world touch her young. He hesitated only a heartbeat more. If he left them here, they wouldn't last another 5 minutes. Hypothermia moved faster than most people realized. He had seen entire rescue teams scramble to save victims who simply never woke again. He wouldn't let these two become another memory buried in snow. With a grunt, he slid his hands beneath the lioness's front half, feeling the cold bite straight through her stiff fur into his palms. The weight surprised him, heavier than he expected for an animal so close to collapse. He braced his legs, pulled, and dragged her over the threshold, the cub slipping out from under her chest and tumbling onto the wooden floor with a soft, heartbreaking cry. The moment the door shut behind them, warmth enveloped the small room, and the storm's roar became muffled, distant but unrelenting. The lioness tried to lift her head, failed, then let it rest heavily on the rug Elias had spread near the stove. Her cub crawled toward her, but its legs buckled halfway. Elias scooped it up gently and wrapped it in the emergency wool blanket he kept for stranded hikers. One of the dozens of safety supplies he still kept around, habits drilled into him by years of rescue work and more than one high-risk insurance seminar. "You're all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, the cub, its mother, or himself. He knelt beside the lioness again, examining the frost clinging stubbornly to her whiskers, the ice matting her fur. She had been out there far too long, long enough to make it a miracle she'd walked at all. Then, just as he leaned in, her ear twitched. Her eyes opened a fraction, amber but dulled by exhaustion. She looked at him, not with the raw wildness he had come to expect from this species, but with a quiet, indescribable recognition. Trust wasn't the right word. It was older than trust, more primal, a mother choosing the only chance left to her. Outside, the storm thundered against the roof. Inside, Elias placed another log into the stove and watched the flames rise, throwing warm light over the broken family lying on his floor. He didn't know how they'd made it to his door or why fate had steered them to him. But as the cub let out a weak, trembling breath, he understood one thing with a clarity that tightened his throat. This night was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of something far more unbelievable. The cabin's warmth began to settle around the room like a fragile shield, though the storm kept pounding the walls as if trying to break in. Elias moved slowly, careful not to jar the lioness as he laid thick towels beneath her body. Melted snow dripped from her fur, pooling on the rug. In the glow of the stove, she looked less like the apex predator he'd spent decades studying and more like a mother stripped to her most vulnerable form. Each breath she took rattled faintly, as though pulled from the bottom of a well. The cub in Elias's blanket mewed again, a thin sound that might have been lost if the night weren't otherwise so still. He carried the little one closer to the stove, adjusting the flame until the warmth radiated gently. Not too hot, not too fast. Hypothermia demanded patience. Even the insurance safety sheets pinned to his wall reminded him that one wrong move, too much heat, too suddenly, could cause shock. The cub shifted weakly, its tail flicking once, and Elias felt a flicker of hope. "Stay with me," he murmured, instinctively using the same tone he once used for stranded hikers fighting sleep on frozen trails. Behind him, a soft thump stirred the air. The lioness had tried to lift her head, only to drop it again. Her gaze tracked him with a foggy awareness. She seemed to be measuring him, not as prey, not as threat, but as a strange, uncertain ally who had pulled her from the jaws of the blizzard. Her flank twitched with each shiver. Elias knelt beside her, placing his hand gently against her ribs. The pulse beneath his palm was faint, but steady. "You're safe here," he said. He didn't expect her to understand. Still, the words felt necessary, as if saying them aloud made the fragile sanctuary more real. For a moment, the lioness closed her eyes in something like resignation. Trust wasn't something he associated with these animals. Respect, yes. Wariness, always. But trust? It was unheard of. Yet here she was, too exhausted to defend herself, too desperate to care. Another gust slammed the cabin, rattling the window panes. Elias rose to secure the shutters, but before he reached the door, a sharp rap, 3 quick knocks, cut through the storm's roar. He stiffened. No one should be out here in these conditions, not unless they absolutely had to be. He stepped to the door and peered through the frosted glass. A figure hunched against the wind, parka hood pulled low, snow caked over the shoulders. Elias opened the door a crack. "Marin?" The young ranger shoved her way inside, breath shaking from cold. "Thank God you're alive," she gasped. "I saw strange tracks on the ridge, and then your chimney smoke nearly vanished. I thought the wind had taken the whole roof off." She stomped snow from her boots, then froze as her eyes swept the room. Her voice thinned. "Elias, what is that?" He shifted his body subtly, blocking her view of the lioness as best he could. An injured animal. That's not a deer, Marin said sharply. She took a step sideways, and in that moment she saw. The collapsed mountain lion, the limp cub bundled near the fire, the towels soaking up melted ice around them. Her hand instinctively moved toward the radio strapped to her vest. "Elias, you should have called this in. This is dangerous. There's a male roaming the area. Big one. Killed 2 goats on Miller's property last week. If this lioness crossed with him nearby—" "I know," Elias interrupted softly. "I've seen the tracks, but she came here helpless. And the cub—" Marin shook her head. "You can't keep a wild predator in your living room. That's not compassion. That's risk. You taught me that during wildfire training." Elias tried to steady his breath. "And I also taught you that survival isn't always clean. Sometimes you save what's in front of you because you're the only chance it has." Before she could answer, a deep, distant rumble drifted through the storm. Not thunder, something more primal. The lioness tensed, her eyes flashing open with fear. Elias felt the shift in her body, the way a dying ember fights for one more spark. She tried to rise, stumbled, but still managed a low growl that vibrated weakly through the floorboards. Marin's eyes widened. That was a male. Close. Elias nodded grimly. "He's been circling?" For the first time, Marin looked at the lioness not with fear, but with dawning realization. "She didn't come here by accident," she whispered. "She was running." "And I don't think she'll survive the night without help," Elias said. The ranger hesitated, torn between protocol and instinct. She glanced at the radio again. "If I call this in, they'll send a team, with tranquilizers, maybe lethal rounds if the male shows up." "That's why I'm asking you not to call yet," Elias replied. "Just give me time. Let her live through the night." Marin exhaled slowly, conflict etched across her face. She stepped closer to the lioness, studying the frost still clinging to her whiskers and the shallow rise and fall of her chest. When the cub let out a thin cry, something in the ranger's expression softened. "All right," she said at last. "One night. But if anything changes, anything at all, we follow procedure." Elias nodded, relief cutting through his exhaustion. Marin grabbed a blanket from the wall hook and draped it over her shoulders. "I'll stay until the storm eases," she added. "No one should handle this alone." Outside, the wind continued to snarl against the cabin, but inside, an uneasy truce settled into place. Elias checked the cub once more, then returned his focus to the lioness. Her eyes were half closed, but they found his again, steady and unguarded. It struck him how fragile the line was between life and death, between fear and trust. He adjusted the stove's damper and settled beside her. "Rest now," he whispered. "You're safe." But somewhere beyond the cabin walls, another growl broke through the storm, a reminder that safety was temporary, fragile, and already slipping toward tomorrow's danger. The storm raged deep into the night, no longer a passing blizzard, but a full force of nature swallowing the mountains whole. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed with a stubborn determination, though every few minutes the wind outside tried to tear its warmth away. Marin dozed lightly in a chair by the window, her hand never straying far from the radio at her hip. Elias sat beside the lioness, one palm resting near her ribs, feeling the faint tremor of each breath. She had gained a whisper of warmth, but she was still far too weak, and the cub, bundled in wool, slept with its nose tucked beneath its tiny paw. As dawn tried to push its way through the storm, the lioness stirred. Her ears twitched first. Then her nose lifted from the rug. A low vibration rolled through her chest, not a growl meant for Elias or Marin, but something ancient, instinctive, sharpened by generations of mothers who knew danger by scent alone. Elias leaned in. "Easy," he whispered, though his voice betrayed an unease he couldn't hide. Marin shifted in her chair, blinking awake. Something out there? Before Elias could answer, the lioness forced herself upright. The movement was shaky, unnatural, fueled by fear rather than strength. She took 2 steps toward the door and swayed, nearly collapsing. Elias caught her shoulder out of pure reflex, and even in her weakened state, he felt the sheer power coiled beneath her skin. A healthy mountain lion could kill a grown man in seconds. But this one looked at him not as prey or threat, only as an obstacle delaying her from whatever danger prowled the storm outside. Marin moved to the window, her breath caught. "Elias! Tracks!" He joined her, peering through the frost. A dark shape crossed the ridge just beyond the tree line. Heavy, broad-shouldered, purposeful. Even through the swirling snow, Elias recognized the gait, the heavy, earth-shaking stride of a dominant male mountain lion. And this one looked enormous. Predators drawn close to human homes were always unpredictable, and liability concerns alone would have sent most people calling for state wildlife officers. Worse still, a territorial male had every reason to kill unrelated cubs. It was nature's merciless economic cycle, a way to reset breeding opportunities. The lioness let out a soft, urgent sound, part cry, part warning. She staggered forward and pressed her body against the door, claws scraping the wood. She wasn't trying to escape the warmth. She was trying to protect her cub. Terror flashed in her eyes in a way Elias had never seen in any apex predator. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you go out in that condition, you won't last 10 minutes. The lioness didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She opened her jaws, letting out a broken hiss of frustration. Then she slumped sideways, breathing hard. The cub woke with a confused chirp, unaware of the danger creeping closer. Marin stepped back from the window. "We can't keep them here if the male decides to come down off that ridge. He'll smell the cub. He'll come right to the door." Elias shook his head. "We can't move her. Not like this." "And we can't just sit here waiting for him to test the cabin walls," she shot back. "We need to scare him off before he gets too close." But Elias was no longer listening. His eyes were fixed on the lioness. She was staring up at him, weak, trembling, but filled with a fear deeper than instinct. She nudged her cub toward him with her muzzle. A plea. A command. A mother asking another creature, even of a different species, to protect her child if she could not. The storm pressed harder against the cabin as though urging the moment forward. Elias swallowed. "I'll go," he said quietly. Marin spun around. "Absolutely not. You're not going out there alone." "I won't be alone," he answered, grabbing the flare gun from the wall. "I'll have this." "That's not what I meant," she snapped. "If something happens—" "If that male gets inside this cabin, you won't be able to stop him," Elias interrupted. "But I might be able to push him back from a distance." Marin hesitated, torn between sense and instinct. Wind shrieked through the cracks in the shutters. Every passing second brought the male closer. Finally she nodded, jaw clenched. "Stay where I can see you. If the wind whiteouts completely, you turn back." Elias zipped his parka, tightened his gloves, and stepped toward the door. The lioness dragged herself forward and brushed her head lightly against his knee. It was not affection. It was desperation. It was acknowledgement. It was everything instinct should have forbidden. When Elias opened the door, the snow bit into him like sharp teeth. The world outside had dissolved into a chaos of blowing white, the ground indistinguishable from the air. But he pressed forward, boots sinking deep into the drift. Marin stood at the threshold, tracking movement with her flashlight beam. He reached the clearing and cocked the flare gun. The male's growl rippled through the storm, a deep, resonant warning that vibrated in Elias's bones. The shadow on the ridge moved again, bigger, closer, testing the wind. Elias fired the first flare. The red streak screamed into the dark, lighting the snow in a violent scarlet glow. The male roared back, more startled than frightened, but the hesitation bought them seconds. Elias fired a second flare, stepping forward. "Go on," he shouted. "Get back into the timber where you belong." For a moment, the explosion of red light seemed to push the male up the ridge. But then Elias's boot caught a hidden crust of ice. The ground vanished beneath him. He fell hard, too hard, sliding down a shallow ravine he'd crossed 100 times in summer, but had forgotten during winter's disguise. Snow swallowed him whole. His head struck a buried branch and stars burst behind his eyes. Pain shot through his leg, white-hot and blinding. When he tried to move, something heavy pinned him down. A fallen tree, buried under the snow, had locked his leg beneath it. He dragged in a breath, tasting ice. He tried again to pull free, but the pain flared so violently he saw black. "Marin!" he shouted, but the blizzard devoured his voice. No one could hear him. For the first time in years, Elias felt real fear, not for his research, not for the mountains he loved, but for the fragile lives he had left behind in that cabin. If he couldn't return, the lioness and her cub would be defenseless when the male came down the slope. Snow thickened over his coat. His body began to tremble. He knew the signs. Hypothermia crept slowly at first, then all at once. He reached for the flare gun, but it had fallen out of reach, half buried in the drift. His breath weakened. The world narrowed to wind and cold and failing strength. He whispered into the storm, "Someone, please." But the Rockies answered only with silence until a shape moved through the white. Low, muscular, determined, a shape he knew. The lioness. Her eyes burned through the storm like twin embers. She stepped toward him, staggering from exhaustion, but alive with purpose. Elias let out a broken breath. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. But she was, and nothing in the mountains would stop her now. The storm had swallowed every bit of color from the world, leaving only shifting shades of white and gray. Elias lay half buried in the ravine, the cold chewing its way through his coat, through his bones, through the last scraps of strength he had left. His breath came in jagged threads, each one thinner than the last. He tried again to lift the fallen tree, pinning his leg, but his fingers barely responded. Cold had a way of numbing not just the body, but the will. He felt it creeping inward now, slow as poison. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, allowing the wind to rush over him. If this was how the mountains chose to take him, then so be it. He had spent a lifetime respecting their power, warning others never to underestimate their danger. He had given those very talks at public safety workshops, telling people to prepare, to insure themselves, to respect winter weather advisories. Now he was living the consequences of ignoring every warning he had taught. Then a sound cut through the blizzard, a low, steady rumble, growing closer. Elias forced his eyes open. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks on him, shaping the snow into moving shadows. But out of the white, a form took shape, a golden, frost-laced silhouette pushing through the wind with painful determination. The mother mountain lion reached him with a stagger that nearly toppled her, but she held herself up, breath steaming in the frigid air. For a long second she simply stared at him, her eyes wide and wild and full of something that did not belong to instinct alone. Concern, recognition, a spark of the same fragile trust he had seen flicker in her earlier, now burning brighter against the cold. "You shouldn't have come," Elias whispered, though his voice barely broke free of his lips. The lioness ignored him. She sniffed the air around his body, circling once with agonizing slowness, her paws sinking deep with each step. Her muscles trembled beneath her matted fur. She was still weak, too weak to fight off a male, too weak to hunt, too weak even to stand much longer. And yet she did not retreat. She lowered her head and pressed her cheek to his shoulder. Warmth, real, living warmth. It spread through Elias like a shock, stirring everything the cold had tried to silence. He felt his heartbeat kick back against the numbness. He felt the world tilt, not into darkness this time, but toward a thin, impossible thread of hope. The lioness shifted her weight, examining the fallen tree. She tested it with her muzzle, nudging it, then pushing harder. Elias gritted his teeth as pain shot through him, but he didn't tell her to stop. She backed up, bracing herself with what little strength remained, and shoved again. Snow flew. The log shifted half an inch, but slipped back immediately. She growled, not at him, but at the obstacle, the storm, the world that had cornered her and now threatened the one living being who had shown her mercy. With another trembling, "Push!" She drove her shoulder against the trunk. Her legs shook violently. The tree rolled only a little this time, barely widening the gap trapping Elias's leg. She backed up again, panting hard, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Her body wasn't built for this. She was starving, frostbitten, drained from keeping her cub alive. But she refused to stop. Elias felt something sting his eyes, something warm, unfamiliar. Grief? Gratitude? Awe? The line between them blurred in the snow. "Easy," he whispered. "You'll hurt yourself." The lioness stepped closer, lowered her head, and pressed it beneath his arm, lifting him just enough to shift his weight. Her body wrapped itself along his side, shielding him from the worst of the wind. She stayed like that for several breaths, letting her warmth seep into him. He had no right to expect this. Every rule of the wild said she should have fled the moment she could stand. Survival was a selfish currency in the mountains. Yet here she was, giving him the one thing she could not spare. Suddenly she raised her head and released a roar, weak but fierce, sending vibrations through the ravine. The sound traveled farther than any human shout could have, rolling up the slope and across the storm-lashed clearing. Elias could only hope Marin heard it. The lioness braced herself once more. She positioned her paws, dug her claws into the frozen earth, and pushed. This time she added a desperate thrust of her entire body. The log moved. Not far, not enough, but enough for Elias to feel hope swell again. A second push came, even weaker. A third, fueled by whatever fire remained inside her. The log shuddered, then shifted just enough to release his leg. Elias gasped at the sudden rush of pain. His body curled instinctively, but the lioness was already beside him, steadying him, keeping him upright. He tried to drag himself backward, but his leg buckled immediately. He would not make it far on his own, not in this cold, not like this. The lioness lowered herself carefully, pressing her side against his chest once more, inviting him into the circle of warmth she used for her cub. He leaned into her, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs, a steady, stubborn rhythm that defied every law of survival. She stayed that way, unmoving, even as the storm screamed around them. Minutes passed, maybe more. Elias lost track of time. He felt the numbness crawling back, but weaker now, pushed away by her body heat. He stayed awake only because she refused to let him drift. Each time his head slumped forward, she nudged him gently, reminding him to breathe, to fight, to stay. Then a new sound pierced the wind, a human voice, faint but undeniable. "Elias!" He tried to lift his head. "Marin?" Flashlights cut through the snow. Figures in ranger jackets scrambled down the slope. The lioness lifted her head, but didn't move away. She stayed beside him even as the strangers approached, even as the storm began to ease, even as help finally reached them. And in that impossible moment, predator guarding man, man clinging to predator, the mountains held their breath. Because something had shifted in the balance of fear and trust, something that did not belong to instinct or survival or logic. It belonged to the bond formed in the firelight of a lonely cabin. And now, forged in the heart of a storm, it would change everything still to come. Snow churned under bootsteps as Marin and 2 other rangers descended the ravine, their flashlights cutting shaky tunnels of light through the storm's thinning veil. Elias blinked against the brightness, his vision blurring at the edges, drifting between the sting of cold and the warmth of the lioness pressed firmly against him. She didn't retreat when the rescuers approached. Instead, she shifted, placing her weakened body even more squarely between Elias and the strangers, her breath rising in trembling clouds. Her tail flicked once in warning, but she made no sound. It was a protective stance, not a threatening one. Marin skidded to a stop, shock widening her eyes. Dear God, she's guarding him. The ranger beside her, a young man named Rowan, froze with his hand already on his tranquilizer rifle. Marin, protocol. We can't move in with her like that. She's not attacking, Marin said, voice tight but steady. Look at her. She's freezing, exhausted. If she wanted him dead, he wouldn't still be breathing. Rowan hesitated, but training tugged hard at his instincts. We've got to get Elias out. If she lunges... She won't, Elias croaked, his voice thin as the wind. She saved me? The lioness shifted her gaze toward him at the sound of his voice, then back to the rangers. Her ears pressed flat, not with aggression, but with fear. She understood the tension in the air. Apex predators knew the smell of danger, gun oil, adrenaline, human uncertainty. And she responded the only way she could, by staying exactly where she was, shielding him with her own body. Rowan raised his rifle another inch. I'm sorry, but we can't risk... Marin! Elias forced the name out like a lifeline. Tell them. She's not the threat here. The male is still nearby. Marin scanned the surrounding slopes, her breath catching when she saw a fresh set of heavy tracks gouged into the snow higher up the ridge. The storm had softened their edges, but the size and stride were unmistakable. The male had been close, too close, and it explained everything. The lioness's desperation, her courage, even the impossible choice she made when she followed Elias into the blizzard. She came for him, Marin whispered, her voice cracking. I heard her roar. She was calling for help. Rowan lowered the rifle only slightly. That's not how this works. Predators don't call for help. Then explain what you're seeing, Marin snapped back. Explain why she's keeping him warm instead of tearing into us. Rowan faltered. Logic crumbled in the face of what stood in front of them, a creature whose behavior had no place in textbooks, safety guidelines, liability reports, or wildlife policy manuals. The lioness was trembling violently now, whether from fear or exhaustion or cold, Elias couldn't tell. But she never broke her stance. She was a wall, a barrier, a mother. The third ranger, and no older man named Collins, stepped forward with slow, practiced caution. He'd spent 40 years in the field, long enough to know when protocol had to bend to reality. Look at her paws, he murmured. She's been through hell, and she still chose to follow him. The lioness flicked her eyes toward him. Collins lowered his hands, palms open. Easy, girl. We're here to help. The wind calmed just enough for the moment to stretch thin and trembling. Then the cub appeared at the top of the ravine. It had followed its mother's scent trail, its tiny body wobbling in the snow. When it saw her, it chirped weakly and stumbled down the slope. The sound that left the lioness was not a growl, but a broken rumble of relief. She nudged Elias once, as if apologizing, and turned her head toward her cub. The small gesture broke something open in the rescuers. Even Rowan lowered his weapon fully. Marin took a careful step closer. We're going to lift him now, she said gently. If you understand anything we're doing, don't move. Don't panic. The lioness did not move. She watched every motion, the unfolding of the stretcher, the slow reach toward Elias's shoulders, the way the Rangers worked in coordinated rhythm. But she didn't interfere. She only leaned her weight against him long enough to ensure he stayed warm until the last possible moment. When the Rangers finally eased Elias onto the stretcher, the lioness hesitated. Her paws dug into the snow, uncertain whether she should follow or stay. Her cub pressed itself against her leg, letting out another small cry. She nudged it closer to her chest, torn between instincts pulling her in two directions. Elias reached out with a shaking hand. His fingertips brushed her muzzle. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're alive. Because of you." For the first time since she appeared at his door, the lioness blinked slowly, one long, deliberate motion that felt like a language older than the mountains themselves. As the Rangers lifted the stretcher up the slope, she followed, not with aggression, not with ownership, but with certainty. Each step cost her, yet she refused to let Elias out of her sight. The cub followed, stumbling through the snow, but determined to stay beside its mother. Rowan whispered, almost reverently, "I've never seen anything like this." Collins nodded. "Sometimes the wild surprises us. Sometimes it teaches us." About halfway up the slope, Marin glanced over her shoulder. The lioness was panting hard, each breath shaking through her ribs. Yet her eyes never left Elias. She was making sure he survived. She was finishing what she started the moment she appeared at his door. When they reached the ridge above the ravine, Marin held up a hand. "Let's stop here. Let her catch up." The lioness stepped forward until her muzzle brushed the edge of the stretcher. She touched Elias's hand again, as if confirming he was still real, still breathing. Then, with a trembling sigh, she lowered herself beside him. She didn't collapse out of weakness. She chose to lie next to him, to let him feel her warmth one last time before the Rangers took him where she could not follow. Marin knelt inches from the lioness, tears prickling her eyes. "We're not your enemies," she whispered. "We'll help him, I promise." The lioness didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, and, amazingly, she trusted it. The Rangers lifted the stretcher again. This time, the lioness did not rise to follow. She watched them carry Elias across the wind-swept ridge, her cub pressed against her belly, her breath shallow but steady. For a creature shaped by solitude and survival, that moment of stillness was more profound than any roar. Only when the stretcher disappeared behind the trees did she finally lay her head on her paws. The storm had passed. But the miracle she had created, the one she had fought for with every last shred of strength, was still unfolding. The storm finally broke overnight, leaving the mountains washed in a pale, exhausted light. Elias woke to the muted crackle of a stove fire and the antiseptic scent of medical supplies. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then the weight of memory returned, snow, pain, her warmth, her roar. He blinked slowly, realizing he was back inside his cabin, his leg wrapped in a thick brace, the room reorganized by human hands. Marin sat in a chair beside him, chin resting against her chest as she dozed. Outside, the world was quiet again, the kind of quiet that follows danger, not peace. His voice came out rough. "How long?" Marin startled awake. "You're up." Relief softened her expression. "We brought you in before sunrise, hypothermia, a fractured tibia, and bruising all over, but you'll recover." Collins went back to check the ravine. Rowan followed the lioness and her cub. They made it to the tree line. She paused as if choosing something carefully. "They're alive, Elias. She stayed with you until we carried you out." He closed his eyes, absorbing that truth like warmth returning to frozen skin. The image of her, muddy gold against the storm, standing guard, rose vividly in his mind. A primal guardian appointed not by nature, but by choice. "Is she safe?" he asked. For now, Marin answered, but she needs time, and so do you. Over the next 2 days, the world settled into a strange rhythm. Rangers rotated through to bring medical supplies and check on the weakening structure of the cabin roof. Winter storms weren't forgiving, and even insurance coverage didn't guarantee repairs before spring. Elias spent most hours resting, drifting between wakefulness and a fog of exhaustion. In those quiet stretches, he replayed the lioness's actions over and over, the way she pushed the log, the way she shielded him, the way she refused to abandon him, though instinct screamed for her to save herself and her cub. The bond was something he couldn't name, something beyond animal behavior models or predator-prey logic, something deeper. Late on the 3rd day, Marin returned from a patrol with news. We spotted her trail again, she said. Faint but steady. She's moving better. The cub's tracks are right beside hers. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Good. That's good. You'll see them again, Marin said softly. I can feel it. But he wasn't sure. Creatures of the wild rarely returned to a place where they'd nearly died. The mountain lion mother had been driven by desperation, fear, and an instinct older than language. Now that she'd regained strength, she had every reason to vanish into the vastness of the Rockies forever. By the 5th morning, the snow had softened into a glittering crust under the rising sun. Elias felt strong enough to hobble outside on the wooden crutches Marin had carved for him. The cold air stung, but the sky was clear, the kind of crisp, immaculate blue that makes the mountains look endless. The forest below the ridge shimmered with new ice and old secrets. He paused at the porch railing, letting the quiet settle around him. Only the faint drip of melting snow broke the stillness. As he shifted his weight, something unusual near the steps caught his eye. A line of indentations in the snow, small, round, deliberate, paw prints, not from a stray bobcat or fox. These were unmistakable. He had studied them his whole life. Mountain lion tracks, 2 sets, one larger, one impossibly small, leading right up to the porch, and stopping there. Elias's breath hitched. He lowered himself carefully to one knee, tracing the edge of a print with trembling fingers. The snow around it had hardened just enough to preserve the shape. She had come close, so close she could have nudged the door again. She hadn't needed to, because beside the prints, laid neatly on the wood, was a small pine branch. Its needles were still bright, untouched by frost. Mountain lions were not creatures that left gifts. They didn't gather, didn't arrange, didn't offer anything beyond what survival demanded. Yet here was the branch, placed with intention, not dropped, not trampled, placed. He looked toward the forest, scanning the shadows between the pines. Nothing moved, but he felt eyes somewhere out there, watching quietly, not out of fear, out of recognition, gratitude even, a silent message in the only language she could give. We lived because of you. Footsteps approached behind him. Marin stepped onto the porch and followed his gaze. You saw it too, she murmured. I checked the cameras. She held up a small trail cam screen. There's more. She pressed play. The grainy footage showed the lioness emerging from the tree line under moonlight, thinner but steady. The cub trotted at her side, its gait clumsy but determined. She paused at the edge of the porch, sniffed the air, then gently placed the pine branch on the step. Before leaving, she turned her head toward the door, a single lingering glance, then faded into the dark. Elias's throat tightened. Something deep inside him shifted, a place that had been cold and closed for years. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. She remembered. She trusted you, Marin said. That doesn't happen every day. Not in wildlife, not in life in general. He didn't answer right away. The mountains stretched before him, ancient and indifferent, yet holding a story now carved into their silence. A story of choosing trust over instinct, compassion over fear. A story he never expected to live. As the morning light rose, Elias lifted the pine branch carefully, as though it were something sacred. "If they ever need me again," he murmured, "they know where to find me." A breeze swept across the ridge, stirring the trees, almost as if the mountains whispered back. The lioness and her cub were gone, but not gone. Somewhere among the frozen valleys and sunlit cliffs, they carried a piece of him with them, just as he carried a piece of them now, a reminder that even in the wildest corners of the world, miracles sometimes return to the very door where they first began. And for the first time in years, Elias stepped back into his cabin with a heart warmed not by fire, but by hope.